Introduction. Why philosophy in the Islamic world, and not simply Islamic philosophy? There would have been other options too: Arabic philosophy, or even Islamicate philosophy. The last of these would be perfect, if only Islamicate were a real word. It was invented in recent decades to express what I mean by the Islamic world, which is to say, the geographical areas that have fallen within Islamic political and cultural control from the rise of Islam down to the present. But I don't think it has caught on enough to be used in a book title. Neither Islamic nor Arabic philosophy fits the bill either. The trouble with Islamic philosophy is that many important philosophers in the Islamic world were not Muslims. Christian thinkers played a major role in the initial reception and interpretation of Hellenic philosophy, and some of the greatest Jewish philosophers of all time, above all, Maimonides, lived and worked in the Islamic world, especially in Muslim Spain. Arabic philosophy suffers from a similar problem. Philosophy in the Islamic world has been written in languages other than Arabic, especially Syriac, Hebrew, and Persian. So then, philosophy in the Islamic world. What should we expect this to include? Well, let's start at the beginning. Islam was born in the 7th century A.D. See Box 1, with the revelation given to the Prophet Muhammad, known as the Quran. Box 1. The Islamic Calendar. If you are willing to memorize just one date while listening to this book, let it be A.D. 622, which is the year that the Prophet Muhammad led his followers from his home city of Mecca to settle in Medina. The Muslim calendar is dated from that event, so that you can calculate a year in the Islamic calendar by taking the A.D. date by subtracting 622. Or you could, if the Islamic calendar were solar, but it is actually a lunar calendar, and lunar years are shorter than solar years. So the further towards the present you go, the less you have to subtract to get the right answer. I'm writing this introduction in August A.D. 2014, which falls in 1435 A.H., a gap of only 579 years. Just as A.D. stands for Anno Domini, meaning Year of Our Lord, A.H. stands for Anno Hijri, referring to the Arabic Hijra, the pilgrimage to Medina. In the rest of this book, I'll give only the A.D. dates, which I assume will be more useful to most. The revelation handed down to Muhammad insisted on the oneness of God. Tawheed promised reward for those who believe in and obey him, and threatened punishment for those who do not. Muhammad is identified in the Quran as a paradigm to be emulated by other Muslims. For this reason, memories of the Prophet's deeds and sayings were passed down orally from his companions, and eventually written down by religious scholars. Such a report is called a hadith. Along with the Quran, hadith forms the basis of Islamic religious teaching and also Islamic law. That's a sketch of the beginnings of Islam itself. What about the beginnings of philosophy under Islam? It's usual to identify the beginning of philosophy in the Islamic world with a translation movement that began more than 200 years after the age of the Prophet. From the end of the 8th century until the beginning of the 10th century, many works of Greek science and philosophy were rendered into Arabic. The most famous philosophers of the Islamic world, namely Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides responded directly to these translations, and especially the Arabic versions of Aristotle. The tradition they represent was called falsafa. As you can tell, this is just an Arabic version of the Greek word philosophia, so that the very name of the discipline marked its foreignness. Usually, what people have in mind when they talk about philosophy in the Islamic world is this Hellenizing tradition of falsafa. I, however, favor a broader understanding, which refuses to ignore material of philosophical interest just because it was not written by so-called philosophers, falasifa. The historian of philosophy will find intriguing ideas in some commentaries on the Quran, tafsir, in classical works on Arabic grammar, and in treatises on the principles of Islamic law, fiqh. But for the purposes of this book, the main traditions that need to be considered alongside falsafa and kalam and Sufism. You will presumably have heard of Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam, and its Jewish counterpart, the Kabbalah, some of whose key texts were written in the Islamic world. Kalam is a less familiar word. In fact, it literally means word, but is usually translated as theology or rational theology. The theologians, or mutakalimun, were said to be doing the science of the word, ilm al-kalam, for reasons that remain somewhat obscure. Perhaps it was because they were exploring the meaning of God's word, that is, His revelation. The mutakalimun explored numerous subjects of obvious philosophical importance, for instance, proofs of God's existence, human freedom, and even atomistic theories of matter. An exclusive focus on falsafa has often gone hand in hand with exclusive focus on a restricted time period, beginning with Al-Kindi in the 9th century and ending with Averroes, who died in 1198. Averroes has frequently been seen as the last philosopher of Islam. This is not only because he is the last great representative of Hellenic-inspired falsafa. It is also because he and his contemporary Maimonides are the last thinkers from the Islamic world to exercise significant influence on Latin medieval philosophy. Taking a European perspective, historians of philosophy have thus tended to ignore later developments in the eastern heartlands of the Islamic world, when philosophy was often pursued in the context of kalam and Sufism. Only recently have scholars begun to explore philosophical developments in the 13th century and beyond. I will duly be sketching those developments in the chronological survey you are about to hear. In the thematic sections of the book, I will be alluding to thinkers from across the ages, right down to the 20th century. Chapter 1. A Historical Whirlwind Tour. Within a few generations of the rise of Islam, the new religion spread across a huge swath of territory, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of India and China in the east. See Map 1. Most of this territory still belongs to the Islamic world today, and more besides. Nowadays, Indonesia is the nation with the highest number of Muslims, and Islam is the second most popular religion in India. Naturally, it would be an exaggeration to say that philosophy has flourished in Islamic culture at all places and times. But the widespread idea that philosophy in the Islamic world declined or even vanished towards the end of the medieval period is equally false. This misconception is so deeply embedded that philosophy in the Islamic world is most often taught at university level as a part of medieval philosophy. Yet the full story goes well past the medieval period and down to the present day. The formative period. The medieval period of Europe overlaps with most of what I am calling the formative period, the time up to Avicenna. Ancient Greek philosophy became known in the Islamic world a couple of centuries before Avicenna, but our story begins earlier, with the arguments that raged among theologians, mutakallimun, in the 8th century. A good place to start would be Wasil ibn Atta, who is given credit for founding the Kalam movement known as the Mutazilites. This label is slightly misleading. The early theologians spent much of their energy arguing with one another and did not see themselves as adhering to a standard list of Mutazilite doctrines. Still, Wasil and several other thinkers, especially Abu Hudayl, did hold views that would later be adopted by thinkers who thought of themselves explicitly as Mutazilites. The Mutazilites were styled as the upholders of unity, tawhid, and justice, adl, a phrase which gives us a good way into seeing how their theological doctrines hung together. They were staunch defenders of God's unity, not exactly a controversial stance given that the core teaching of Islam is monotheism, but they interpreted divine unity in an unusually strict way, rejecting the existence of multiple attributes distinct from God. As for the idea that God is just, the Mutazilites again had a controversial interpretation of this uncontroversial claim. They believed that human reason can discern the nature of moral obligation. For instance, we perceive that it would be unjust, even for God, to punish people for deeds they cannot help committing. This led the Mutazilites to one of their signature doctrines, the affirmation of human freedom. Other theologians objected to the Mutazilites' confident application of human reason. For these opponents, we should base our beliefs on revelation alone. Some went so far as to accept that God has a body because the Quran speaks of him as having a face or as sitting upon a throne. Naturally, the Mutazilites too saw revelation as an indispensable source for theology, those who doubt their credentials as philosophers preferring to reserve this term for thinkers who engaged with the Greek tradition, might point to the fact that the Mutazilites did argue on the basis of citations from the Quran and Hadith. See further, Box 2. But of course, the holy texts of Islam were common ground between all the theologians, except for disagreements about which Hadith should be accepted as reliable. In an effort to solve interpretation deadlocks, debates within Kalam often had recourse to rational argumentation. Box 2. The Mihna. In 833, the Caliph al-Mamun declared his support for a Mutazilite doctrine, the createdness of the Quran. This teaching went together with the Mutazilite understanding of divine unity. The Quran is the word of God, and thus can be seen as one of his attributes. To accept that this word is eternal rather than created would, according to the Mutazilites, make it a second divine entity alongside God himself. That would violate the core Islamic principle of Tawhid, God's oneness. Al-Mamun and his successors, the very caliphs who sponsored the translation of Greek scientific works into Arabic, imposed an inquisition, or test, mihna, in which religious scholars and judges were required to accept that the Quran was created. Some defied the caliphs and were persecuted, most famously Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But in the end, the attempt to enforce theological conformity failed, Ibn Hanbal was widely admired for his stance. One of the 4 orthodox legal schools of Sunni Islam would come to be named for him. After the Mihnah, political rulers of Sunni Islam would generally leave the theological debates to the scholars or ulama, a stark contrast to the top-down enforcement of orthodoxy we find in medieval Christendom. Perhaps for this reason, there has rarely been persecution aimed at philosophical beliefs in the Islamic world, even when those beliefs were markedly opposed to mainstream religious convictions. By contrast, sectarian religious beliefs have often been treated as politically seditious, with Shiites persecuted by Sunni rulers, and vice versa. Another reason to begin our overview before the Greek-Arabic translation movement is that the movement did not occur in a vacuum. Already in late antiquity, Hellenic philosophy, see Figure 1, found its way into a Semitic language, not Arabic, but Syriac. In a foreshadowing of the Abbasid-sponsored Greek-Arabic translation, Christian scholars working at monasteries in Syria produced versions of works by Aristotle and other Greek thinkers. Some Christians, for instance Sergius of Rishaina, composed their own philosophical treatises. This Christian scholarly tradition provided continuity between the Hellenic and Islamic cultures. When Islam spread through the Near East, Greek-speaking Christians fell within its sphere of influence. They retained their religious beliefs, and there continued to be scholars with facility in both Greek and Syriac. So when the Abbasid caliphs and other wealthy patrons of the 8th to 10th centuries decided to have Greek scientific works rendered into Arabic, most of the translators they hired were Christians. This activity was centered in Iraq, and particularly Baghdad, the new capital city founded by the early Abbasid caliph Al-Mansur. One outstanding translation group was gathered around the Christian medical expert Hanin ibn Ishaq. He specialized in translating the works of Galen, the greatest doctor of late antiquity. His son, the somewhat confusingly named Ishaq ibn Hunayn, Ibn means son, so his name simply means Ishaq, son of Hunayn, concentrated on Aristotelian philosophy. Philosophy was also the focus of another group, the Kindi Circle. Their leader was Al-Kindi, the first philosophe of Islam, that is, the first to engage with the newly translated Greek scientific and philosophical works. He does not seem to have known Greek himself, and he was a Muslim, yet he coordinated the efforts of a group of Christian translators. In addition to versions of treatises by Aristotle, the Kindi Circle also produced Arabic translations of works by the 2 greatest late ancient Platonists, Plotinus and Proclus. Probably due to a misunderstanding of prefatory comments that were added to the text in the Kindi Circle, parts of the Arabic versions of Plotinus were transmitted as the Theology of Aristotle. In other words, a major work of ancient Platonism was thought to be by Aristotle himself. A similar confusion attached to the Arabic Proclus. A version of the Kindi Circle translation of Proclus's Elements of Theology became known in Latin Christendom as the Book of Causes, Liber de Causis, also ascribed to Aristotle. Al-Kindi was deeply influenced by these Neoplatonic sources, and by the genuine Aristotle, as well as a wide range of other translated sources. He was particularly interested in mathematical works by authors like Euclid and Ptolemy. He drew these ideas together in a series of treatises, often in the form of epistles addressed to his patrons, who included the Abbasid caliph Al-Mu'tazim, and the Caliph's son, whom Al-Kindi tutored. These treatises set out to prove the agreement between Islam and Greek philosophy in order to display the value of the newly translated materials for the educated elite of Al-Kindi's day. In his most important work, On First Philosophy, Al-Kindi used Greek ideas to portray God's unity in a way reminiscent of the Mutazilites, and to prove that the created universe is not eternal. But Al-Kindi did not restrict his attention to theological questions. He wrote on a bewildering range of topics, from cosmology to ethics to the soul, to more practical topics like swords and perfumes. There are often connections between Al-Kindi's philosophy and his contributions in the applied disciplines. His epistles on cosmology provided an implicit rationale for other treatises on astrology, and his Pythagorean interests in mathematics played a role in several writings on music, and even in a work on pharmacology. We can trace his influence among a number of thinkers who form a Kindian tradition. These figures, who included first, second, and third-generation students of Al-Kindi, followed his lead in seeing harmony between Islam and Greek philosophy, especially the Platonism they found in the Arabic versions of Plotinus and Proclus. The most important representatives of this tradition were Al-Amiri, author of, among other things, a reworking of the Arabic Proclus materials, and Miskawayh, who quoted Al-Kindi at the end of his influential ethical treatise, The Refinement of Character. Thinkers of the Kindian tradition, like Al-Kindi himself, tended to be all-round intellectuals and not just philosophers. Throughout the formative period, philosophy was frequently pursued as just one among several cultivated arts among the intelligentsia. See Figure 2. Miskawayh, for instance, is well known for his work as a historian. But philosophy also had its detractors. In a famous debate at the court of a Baghdad vizier, a Christian philosopher and exponent of the quintessential Hellenic discipline of logic, Abu Bishr Mata was publicly embarrassed by a grammarian, Al-Sirafi. Abu Bishr lost the battle, but not the war. Eventually, logic would be widely adopted by Muslim theologians. In the shorter term, a group of Aristotelian philosophers associated with Abu Bishr would flourish for several generations. Mostly this group, the Baghdad Peripatetics, were Christians who devoted their attention to commenting on Aristotle with forays into Trinitarian theology and biblical exegesis. The most outstanding Christian member of the school was Yahya ibn Adi, from whom we have a number of philosophical and theological treatises. But a more famous name belongs to a Muslim connected to the group, Al-Farabi. He shared his Christian colleagues' interest in logic and likewise wrote commentaries on Aristotle. His fame is, however, due more to his original systematic works, which integrate Aristotelian philosophy with themes of Neoplatonism. Against this cosmological and metaphysical setting, he set out an innovative political philosophy, influential on later thinkers like Averroes and Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Jews as well as Christians played a major role in the philosophy of the formative period. We have a polite philosophical correspondence between Yahya ibn Adi and a Jewish philosopher, and Al-Kindi's writings were used extensively by one of the earliest Jewish thinkers in the Islamic world, Yitzhak Israeli. Jews who adopted ideas from the Islamic theology of their day. The chief example is Saadia Gaon, a formidable scholar who wrote on Jewish law and Hebrew grammar, translated the Bible into Arabic, and composed a major philosophical theological work, the Book of Doctrines and Belief. He has much in common with Al-Kindi, for instance in his discussion of the eternity of the universe. But Sa'adiyya is most often compared to the Mutazilites, whose positions on human freedom and divine attributes he echoed and further developed. Box 3. Al-Razi versus the Ismailis. The works translated in the Kindi circle were popular among not just Sunni Muslims, but also among Shiites, and particularly the group of Shiites called Ismailis. Shiite Muslims believed that legitimate rule over the Muslim community should have passed directly from the Prophet Muhammad to his cousin and son-in-law Ali, and then to Ali's line of male descendants, with different branches of Shiite Muslims accepting different descendants as the legitimate leaders of the faith, or imams. Some Ismaili missionaries used Platonist concepts to explain the special insight granted to the imam. They were challenged by Sunni Muslims, including a man with a very idiosyncratic approach to philosophy and religion, Abu Bakr al-Razi. One of the greatest doctors of Islam, al-Razi developed his philosophy under the inspiration of the ancient medical writer Galen rather than Aristotle. His resulting theory of 5 eternal principles was set out in works that are now lost, but we have reports about it from the greatest intellectual opponents, the Ismailis. They portrayed him as an irreverent heretic who denied the validity of all prophecy. He responded to one such critic by accusing the Ismailis of slavish devotion to authority. Taqlid. Avicenna. In the wake of the translation movement then, philosophy was developing in different ways among thinkers of various faiths. There was the hardcore Aristotelianism of the Baghdad school, the more ironic and broad-minded stance of the Kindian tradition, anti-philosophical criticism from men like al-Sirafi, and jostling for supremacy between Hellenic-inspired philosophy and Islamic kalam. But the situation would change in the 11th century, thanks to a thinker from the Central Asian city of Bukhara, whose impact was unparalleled. Abu Ali ibn Sina, usually known in English by his Latinized name, Avicenna. As we can see from a brief intellectual autobiography composed by Avicenna, he was a confident and largely self-taught genius who reserved the right to pass judgment on all his philosophical predecessors. In a series of works covering all the departments of philosophy, above all his magisterial Healing, Al-Shifa, Avicenna thoroughly reworked the ideas of the Aristotelian tradition as it had come down to him. After Avicenna, philosophers had a stark choice: take Avicenna as the new starting point, or try to undo the damage by retrieving the authentically Hellenic legacy. In the eastern heartlands of Islam, the latter was attempted by Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who despised Avicenna and tried to go back to Aristotle. But in these regions, nearly everyone chose the former approach of engaging with Avicenna. Sometimes the engagement was highly critical, most famously in the case of al-Ghazali, whose incoherence of the philosophers took aim at Avicenna rather than Aristotle. Over the longer term, theologians in the East would continue to criticize, but also selectively borrow from, Avicenna's philosophy. The result was a long-lived tradition of kalam, shot through with his distinctive terminology and distinctions. Out in the Muslim province of Al-Andalus, modern-day Spain and Portugal, the situation was rather different. Andalusia. Already, the early Andalusian jurist, Ibn Hazm, was able to study with a representative of the Aristotelian Baghdad school. This is the brand of philosophy that, for the most part, won out in Andalusia. Avicenna was much admired by Ibn Tufayl, author of the philosophical novel Hayy ibn Yaqzan, in which the title character grows up alone on a desert island and becomes a self-taught philosopher. But even Ibn Tufayl complained of having poor access to Avicenna's works. His predecessor, Ibn Bajjah, of Empes, was much more influenced by Aristotle and by Al-Farabi, who exerted great influence on both Muslim and Jewish thinkers in Andalusia. Those who drew on Al-Farabi included the greatest Aristotelian exegete of the Islamic world, Ibn Rushd. Like Avicenna, usually known by a Latinized version of his name, Averroes, he produced numerous commentaries on the works of Aristotle in different formats. In them, Averroes shows his mastery of both the Aristotelian texts and his commentators, from late antiquity to Al-Farabi and Ibn Bajjah. Averroes was not particularly influential among Muslim thinkers, for whom his rival of the Baghdad school's Aristotle-centered philosophical project was no longer relevant. But in Latin Christendom, where the works of Aristotle were just attracting renewed interest, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Averroes became the chief guide. Aristotle was called simply the philosopher, and Averroes the communicator. Averroes's influence was perhaps even greater among Jewish readers in Andalusia and beyond. Among readers of Hebrew, it became common to consult Averroes's commentaries and summaries of Aristotle rather than Aristotle himself. The great Jewish commentator, Levi ben Gershon, Gershonides, devoted his exegetical works to the exegeses of Averroes, producing super-commentaries on the latter's commentaries. That was in the 14th century, by which point Jewish philosophy in Andalusia had been a going concern for quite some time. Already in the 11th century we have Solomon ibn Gabirol, Avicebron, and his philosophical treatise, The Fountain of Life, known often by its Latin title, Fons Vitae. This is not an overtly Jewish work, but rather a treatise drawing on Neoplatonic sources to articulate the relationship between God and created things. Ibn Gabirol also wove philosophical themes into his poems, which were a high point of Jewish literature in Andalusia. His Fountain of Life was written in Arabic, but the poems in Hebrew, setting an example for generations to follow, who often wrote philosophy in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic, written in Hebrew letters, whereas poetry and works on Jewish law or biblical commentary were typically in Hebrew. We see this in the greatest Jewish thinker of the medieval age, and arguably of all time, Maimonides, who wrote legal treatises in Hebrew, but philosophy in Arabic. When it came to philosophy, Maimonides adopted the Aristotelian project inherited from Al-Farabi, like his contemporary Averroes. He sought to reconcile this project with the Jewish tradition, clearing up apparent conflicts between the two in his famous Guide for the Perplexed. For some later Jewish thinkers, the Guide was unsettling in its rationalism and devotion to the Aristotelian tradition. Copies of the work were infamously burnt by Christian authorities in southern France in the 1230s. This occurred at the behest of Jewish conservatives who were alarmed by the rationalism of Maimonides and his supporters. For instance, Shmuel ibn Tibbon, who translated the Guide into Hebrew. The so-called Maimonides controversy reflected the deep disagreement among Jews about the value of doing philosophy. But even the opponents of rationalist Maimonideanism acknowledged the authority of Maimonides himself when it came to questions of Jewish law. The development of philosophy in Andalusia stands as the peak of Jewish thought in the medieval period, with Maimonides as the apex of that peak. This was possible because of the favorable conditions enjoyed by Jews in Muslim culture, a general feature of Islamic society throughout the medieval period, but particularly marked in Andalusia. Scholars frequently speak of the convivencia, the living together of Jews, Muslims, and also Christians on the Iberian Peninsula. This came to an end during Maimonides' lifetime with the invasion of the fundamentalist Almohads. Maimonides fled with his family and wound up living and working in Cairo, while other Jews relocated to Christian realms, including southern France. After the Christian reconquest of Andalusia, the situation improved, but there was an appalling pogrom in 1391 when the Jews of Barcelona and elsewhere were massacred. One of the victims was the son of Asdai-Crescas, a brilliant philosopher and critic of Maimonidean Aristotelianism. Almost exactly a century later, the story of Muslim and Jewish thought in Andalusia would come to an end when the last Jews and Muslims were exiled in 1492. Box 4. Mysticism in Andalusia. For the subsequent history of philosophy in the Islamic world, the most influential thinker from Andalusia was Ibn Arabi, born in Murcia, though he later relocated to Damascus. He drew together themes espoused by earlier figures, like the great female mystic, Rabia, and the provocative Sufi martyr, Al-Hallaj. For Ibn Arabi and other Sufis, God lay beyond the grasp of human reason. Yet, he shows himself to us in the form of the universe he has created and in the revelation, especially the names he has given to himself in the Quran. Ibn Arabi set the stage for the later development of philosophical Sufism, perpetuated in Andalusia by Ibn Saba'in, and in Anatolia by Al-Qanawi, who integrated Ibn Arabi's ideas with Avicennan philosophy at the same time as Al-Qanawi's friend, Rumi, was writing his famous mystical poems in the Persian language. Mysticism also blossomed among Jews in Andalusia with the emergence of the Kabbalah, meaning tradition. Kabbalistic authors took inspiration from several late antique texts that adopted a symbolic approach to the divine. For instance, by assigning numerical values to the limbs of God's body, a vivid contrast with the rationalism of Maimonides, who declared it the duty of all Jews to believe in God's incorporeality. One medieval text of the Kabbalah, the Zohar, in fact presents itself as a late antique work. Much as the Sufis sought to grasp God, insofar as possible through his names, the medieval Kabbalists spoke of 10 sfirot, roughly, numbers, through which God shows himself to his creation, while himself remaining utterly transcendent. Reactions to Avicenna. In the East, Avicenna supplanted Aristotle as the philosopher, but he attracted as many critics as admirers. Aside from Al-Ghazali, the most famous critic was Suravardi, founder of what he styled as a new illuminationist, Ishraqi, tradition of philosophy. Like Sufis who were inspired by Ibn Arabi, see Figure 3 in Box 4, Suravardi wove together ideas from the philosophical tradition with mystical themes. But Suravardi's taste was rather exotic when it came to his inspirations. In his greatest work, The Philosophy of Illumination, Hikmat al-Ishraq, he claimed solidarity with ancient sages like Plato, for instance, by affirming the reality of Platonic forms. In fact, Suravardi presented his illuminationism as a recovery of the wisdom of several civilizations, Greek, Persian, and Indian. At the core of this illuminationist philosophy, as the name suggests, was the concept of light. God, the light of lights, creates by spreading forth rays of illumination that become progressively dimmer, with bodies constituting dark obstacles of the divine splendor. All this was put forward in opposition to what Suravardhi called the peripatetic philosophy, which for him meant Avicennism, not Aristotelianism. Alongside Suravardhi and a few thinkers in the subsequent generations who commented on his works, especially al-Shahrazuri, another line of response to Avicenna developed within the Asharite school of Kalam. This school's founder, al-Ashari, began as an adherent of the Mutazilite doctrines but came to reject them. Against the Mutazilites' austere conception of divine unity, the Asharites accepted the distinct reality of God's attributes. They also believed that the Mutazilite stance on human freedom was insufficient to safeguard God's omnipotence, and insisted that God creates absolutely everything other than himself, including human actions. If the core of Mutazilism was its faith in the power of human reason, the core of Asharism was respect for God's untrammeled power and freedom to do as he sees fit. Even moral obligations, from their point of view, arise only once God has laid them upon his creatures. Hence, the Asharites endorsed a divine command theory of morality, whereas the Mutazilites thought that even God must adhere to certain moral principles. Though Mutazilism did live on in the post-formative period, the Asharites, and a similar school, the Maturidis, became the dominant force in Sunni theology. Avicenna seems to have been influenced by Asharism to some extent, though to what extent is a matter of debate. There's no debating the influence in the other direction, as Asharite theology absorbed Avicenna's thought. Even the assault on Avicenna in Al-Ghazali's incoherence falls short of a thorough rejection. After all, he refutes only certain Avicennan theses, implying that the others may be acceptable. A similar range of Avicennan theses was targeted slightly later by another Asharite, al-Shahrastani. Furthermore, al-Ghazali insists on the value of disciplines like logic and astronomy, dismissing critics of the latter by quoting the proverb, "A rational foe is better than an ignorant friend." So it was arguably, in part, thanks to, rather than in spite of al-Ghazali, that Avicennan philosophy, and especially Avicennan logic, became abiding interests of later Asharites. A particularly outstanding representative of philosophical Asharism was Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, who is not to be confused with the aforementioned Abu Bakr al-Razi. The name al-Razi just means someone from the Persian city of Ray. Fakhr al-Din wrote lengthy and complex treatises covering many of the main topics raised by Avicenna's philosophy, enumerating arguments for and against a range of possible views on each topic. Fakhr al-Din was an appreciative exegete of Avicenna as well as a critic. Evidence for this is his detailed, though often critical commentary on Avicenna's late work, Pointers and Reminders, Al-Isharat wal-Tanbihat. This commentary provoked a backlash from the greatest Avicennan of the 13th century, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who wrote a counter-commentary on the Pointers that is far more approving of Avicenna's arguments. Yet al-Tusi was not just a commentator, a kind of second Averroes devoted to Avicenna rather than Aristotle. To the contrary, he was a Protean thinker who at different stages of his career espoused two varieties of Shiite Islam, and who could sound either mystical or highly rationalist, depending on context. Furthermore, al-Tusi made great contributions in the sciences, especially astronomy. He was the head of a group of philosophers and scholars at an astronomical observatory sited at Maraga, in modern-day Azerbaijan. See Figure 4. This group's members were remarkably varied in philosophical approach, though all had an interest in some core disciplines like logic and, of course, astronomy. They include a major illuminationist thinker, Qutb al-Din al-Shirazi, an Avicennan theologian named al-Khatibi, who rethought Avicenna's logic in one of the most widely read theological textbooks of all time, al-Risala al-Shamsiyya, and even a Christian philosopher, Bar Hebraeus. To complete the ecumenical picture, we can add that al-Tusi exchanged philosophical views with Ibn Kamuna, a Jewish thinker who took an interest in Suravardi's illuminationist philosophy. Nor was Ibn Kamuna the first Jewish author involved in this long-running engagement with Avicenna. Earlier, a Jewish Muslim convert named Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi had written the book of what has been carefully considered, Kitab al-Mutabar. As the title suggests, Abul Barakat was passing judgment on previous philosophers, including Avicenna, in much the way that Avicenna had passed judgment on the Aristotelian tradition. In the process, Abul Barakat made some proposals on topics in physics, not unlike those of the aforementioned, but chronologically later, Western Jewish critic of Maimonides, Asdai Kreskas. The Mongol Period. With al-Tusi's group at the Maragha Observatory, we already reached the time of the Mongol invasions, which spread death, destruction, and disruption across the Eastern Islamic lands. Surprisingly, philosophy and scientific activity were able to survive and even find sponsorship under the Mongols. The Maragha Observatory enjoyed the patronage of Ulugh, the Mongol conqueror of Baghdad. According to legend, al-Tusi advised him on how to execute the last Abbasid caliph. A later ruler of Mongol descent, Ulugh Beg, sponsored another observatory at Samarkand. The royal court of Samarkand could also boast of significant intellectuals. For instance, the theologian al-Tatazani. He and earlier Mongol-era Sunni theologians like Aliji produced comprehensive summaries of the philosophically tinged Sunni kalam, pioneered in the previous couple of centuries. These duly became the object of further commentaries and were studied by many generations of young religious scholars in madrasas across the Islamic world. In fact, works by theologians, together with standard commentaries, were still being studied at Al-Azhar University in Cairo in the 20th century, as were logical treatises like the aforementioned Risala al-Shamsiyya of al-Khatibi. In the formative period, intellectuals like al-Kindi and al-Farabi expected philosophy to supplant kalam, using the tools of Hellenic wisdom to provide superior answers to questions raised by the Islamic revelation. In the end, something very different happened. Kalam became a vehicle for the spread of philosophy, albeit that the philosophy in question derived from Avicenna rather than Aristotle or Plotinus. These developments were remarked upon by some of the sharper observers of the time. No observer was sharper than the historian, Ibn Khaldun, who had the luxury of witnessing the Mongol invasion from a safe distance, since he came from the Western Islamic world, the Maghreb. He noted that Hellenic philosophy had been replaced by something new, as if the books of the ancients had never been, and that kalam and philosophy had become effectively indistinguishable. Ibn Khaldun himself stood outside of that tradition. Neither an Avicennan nor a Mutakallim, he innovatively applied the empirical lessons of Aristotelian science to the subject of human history. Looking back over the rise of Islam and the success of tribal groups, like the Almohads in Andalusia, Ibn Khaldun came to a general theory about the rise and fall of the political dynasties. Similar observations about fusion of philosophy with kalam had already been made earlier, with no little alarm, by Ibn Taymiyyah. He promoted a radical approach to jurisprudence. See Box 5, which rejected centuries' worth of legal orthodoxy in favor of what he perceived as the teachings of the first Muslim generations. Ibn Taymiyyah also railed against the various corruptions he perceived in Muslim intellectual life. Unlike the earlier critic of philosophy, al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah had nothing but scorn for the discipline of logic. He wrote at length about its uselessness, remarking that expertise in logic is like camel meat on a mountaintop, hard to reach, and not worth much once you've got it. Nor was he impressed by philosophical Sufis, his phrase, who to his mind represented as grave a threat to Islam as the Mongol hordes. Box 5. The Islamic Legal Schools. There is a long history of mutual interaction between law and philosophy in the Islamic world. It was common for both Jewish and Muslim philosophers to be legal scholars. Al-Ghazali, Averroes, and Maimonides are only the most famous examples. Within Islam there are 4 orthodox legal madhabs, or schools, in Sunni Islam, each named after an esteemed religious authority. The Hanafis, the Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, and the Malikis. They largely agreed on broad methodological issues, but were distinguished by areas of geographical dominance. For instance, the Malikis were the main school in the West, and on many points of legal detail. In addition, the Shiite Muslims had their own legal tradition. Within Sunni Islam, there were other, less influential approaches to law. For instance, the Andalusian jurist Ibn Hazm was a Zahiri, meaning that he followed only the evident, Zahir, meaning of pronouncements in the Quran and Hadith, without drawing analogies or inferences, as did the jurists of the orthodox schools. 3 empires. By the beginning of the 16th century, the chaos caused by the Mongols was fading into memory, and new political realities were settling in. 3 powerful empires controlled most of the Islamic world. See Map 3. The earliest to rise to dominance were the Ottomans, who managed to take Constantinople from the Byzantines in 1453. Somewhat later, in India, rulers with Mongol bloodlines founded the Mughal dynasty. Under both Ottomans and Mughals, philosophy continued along more or less the lines we have seen in the Mongol period. The intellectual sciences were practiced in both empires. Sophisticated astronomical work was done in the Ottoman realm by figures like Ala al-Din al-Kushi. In Mughal India, a standard curriculum developed for the study of philosophical kalam, the so-called Darsi-Nizami, named for Nizam al-Din Sihlavi, a scholar who helped determine which works should be studied. He was a member of the family of scholars, the Farangi Mahal, who emerged in Lucknow in the 18th century. In the 19th century, another family, the Khairabadis, would carry on the practice of study and commentary on the classical works of Avicenizing Kalam. A similar program of study was followed under the Ottomans, though Khatib Çelebi worried that the intellectual sciences were stagnating in his day. Philosophical kalam had competition from other intellectual currents. From the moderate Çelebi, one worry was a populist religious movement. The Qadi-Zadilis, strong critics of corruption among the scholarly class or ulama. Like Ibn Taymiyyah before them, the Qadi-Zadilis also took aim at the excesses of Sufis. But philosophical Sufism continued to thrive in the face of such criticisms. In India, a Mughal prince named Darashikoh even wrote about the harmony between Sufism and the teachings of classical India. A later mystical philosopher of India, Shah Waliullah, was also convinced that multiple religions could represent versions of the single, eternal truth. Through it all, the madrasas of both empires continued to teach students logic, and theologians continued to debate the merits of Avicennan philosophy. Earlier in the Ottoman Empire, a sultan even asked two scholars to offer competing assessments of al-Ghazali's criticism of Avicenna in the incoherence of the philosophers. All of which should make it clear that philosophy and science did not, as is so often supposed, vanish in the Islamic world after the medieval period, and we haven't even mentioned the best known of the later philosophical traditions, which unfolded in Persia. In the early 16th century, the area corresponding to modern-day Iran fell under the sway of the Shiite Safavid dynasty. Just before and during the rise of the Safavids, three significant thinkers emerged in the Persian city of Shiraz: Jalal al-Din al-Dawani, Sadr al-Din al-Dashtaki, and the latter's son, Jayat al-Din al-Dashtaki. A hostile rivalry between the two Dashtakis and Dawani was fought out over questions of logic, metaphysics, and the interpretation of Avicenna. Their mutual refutations, often presented in commentaries or glosses on earlier thinkers, would themselves be made the object of many commentaries in the coming centuries. See Figure 5. But the greatest thinker of early modern Iran is universally acknowledged to be Mullah Sadr. He typified the syncretic tendencies of philosophy under the Safavids. Like the earlier Ismaili thinkers, see Box 3, Safavid philosophers found Hellenic Platonism to be a good fit with Shiite theology, and Greek-Arabic philosophical translations were thus read with the sort of careful attention they had rarely received since Avicenna. We even find commentaries being written on the Arabic Plotinus or theology of Aristotle at this time. Alongside these Hellenic ideas, Sadr drew on materials from Avicenna, Avicennan Kalam, and philosophical Sufism. Yet, he was also a startlingly original thinker whose theory of modulation in being and substantial change promised to resolve long-standing disputes about existence and the nature of God. The Modern Age. Sadra's theories have also met with opposition in some quarters, and though he was always read, he became the central inspiration for Iranian philosophy only from the 19th century onwards. This was in part thanks to sympathetic exegesis by Sabzawari, and more recently, Allama Tabatabayi. Syed Hossein Nasr, originally from Iran, but now an academic based in the United States, has been inspired by Sadr and also by Tabatabayi. The two read philosophy together in Iran. Nasr has also urged a broad, multi-faith, and multicultural perspective that finds commonalities in many traditions within and beyond the borders of Islam. Taking a page from the book of Shah Waliullah, Nasr sees fundamental agreement between a number of religious traditions on a core set of commitments he calls the perennial philosophy. He has even suggested that these shared values could provide an effective basis for environmentalism, since the perennial philosophy urges the subordination of selfish desire to the good of the whole creation. While Sadr and other figures from Islamic history have provided inspiration for latter-day intellectuals, philosophical and scientific ideas from beyond the Islamic world have also had an impact. In the 18th century, Ottoman thinkers like the philosophical Sufi Abdelghani al-Nabalsi were already arguing for a renewal of Islam that would respond positively to the European science. By the 19th century, the Ottoman sultans were looking to European models as they brought in bureaucratic, military, and educational reforms. This helped launch more radical reform movements, the Young Ottomans and Young Turks, who made frequent mention of European philosophy in formulating their political views. The two leading Young Turks, Ziya Gökalp and Abdallah Cevdet, drew respectively on the sociology of Émile Durkheim and the theories of Ludwig Büchner and Auguste Comte. The same point is illustrated by the greatest Muslim political philosopher of the early 20th century, Muhammad Iqbal. Iqbal's political activities in his native India were inspired by the education he received in Europe and by ideas taken from Friedrich Nietzsche. Islamic intellectual history has, in a sense, come full circle. Ideas from European philosophers from Descartes to Heidegger have provoked reactions similar to those that greeted the medieval Greek-Arabic translation movement, outright opposition in some quarters, enthusiastic embrace in others, but most often a circumspect approach of reinterpretation and rethinking in light of the Islamic revelation. Chapter 2. Reason and Revelation. The three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, agree in recognizing a single God who is the source for the existence of all other things, and who has revealed His will to us through a line of prophets. But how should we understand God as a being transcendent beyond all others? What is the nature of the causality He exercised in creating the universe? How does the knowledge granted to the prophet relate to the sort of knowledge available to other humans? If the prophet is also the leader of a community, how does his religious authority relate to his political authority? These questions will all be examined later in this book. First, we're going to look at a more basic issue. How should one go about answering them? It is easy to assume that intellectuals of all three faiths faced a simple choice. They could either use unaided human reason, or they could turn to revelation as found in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. This is a natural assumption for us to make, since we are nowadays quick to see an antithesis between science and religion, between reason and faith. Also, we might also expect the situation in the Islamic world to mirror the situation in Latin Christendom. Medieval Christian thinkers like Aquinas clearly distinguished between theology, which draws on revelation, and philosophy, which uses only the natural light of reason. Something like this distinction was embodied in the very structure of Latin medieval education, with the arts faculty being distinct from the theology faculty in the newly risen universities. But we should try to free ourselves of these assumptions in approaching the Islamic world. It is unhelpful to see the rivalry and ultimate reconciliation between Kalam and Falsafa as a confrontation between faith and reason. Rather, there was a struggle within Kalam itself between more and less rationalist approaches to understanding the revelation brought by Muhammad. Nor should critics of philosophy be indiscriminately tarred with the brush of anti-rationalism. Al-Ghazali criticized Avicenna not for doing philosophy, but for making mistakes in his philosophy. Reckless precipitance of the philosophers would be a more literal translation of the title of his Tahfut ul-Falasifa than incoherence of the philosophers. Ibn Taymiyyah insisted that reason, aql, is in full agreement with the Quranic revelation, though his understanding of reason was not the same as that of the philosophers. Other, more mystically inclined authors pointed to the limitations of reason, yet they often granted, even emphasized, that rational argument was effective within its proper boundaries. The standards of reasoning. Deciding what can and cannot be achieved using human reason presupposes an understanding of rationality itself. For authors drawing on the Greek tradition, such an understanding was readily available in the form of Aristotelian logic. Treatises from Aristotle's logical corpus, or organon, see Box 6, were among the first Greek works translated into Arabic. They were immediately put to use, sometimes in surprising contexts. Al-Kindi, for instance, deployed ideas from Aristotle's categories to prove the immateriality of the soul and to refute the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. A couple of generations later, the Christian logician Yahya ibn Adi wrote a counter-refutation. Adherents of falsafa were distinguished by nothing so much as their interest and expertise in logic. Box 6. The Organon. The ancients referred to a group of 9 Aristotelian logical treatises as the organon, or instrument, in keeping with their understanding of logic as the indispensable instrument for doing philosophy. The first text in the series was actually not by Aristotle. An introduction, Isagoge, to logic by the late ancient Platonist, Porphyry, a student of Plotinus. Students of philosophy would start with this and then go through the following works of Aristotle: Categories, On Interpretation, Prior Analytics, Posterior Analytics, Topics, Sophistical Refutations, Rhetoric, Poetics. As a list of works on logic, this is rather surprising. Really, only the Prior Analytics looks more or less like logic as we would imagine it, as Aristotle there set out the types of valid argument and how they relate to one another. After Avicenna's pioneering work on logic, this also became the main focus of attention among logicians in the Islamic world. Its sequel, the Posterior Analytics, is something more like a treatise on epistemology or philosophy of science. It delineates the requirements that have to be satisfied in order for us to take something as scientifically demonstrated. The topics deals with dialectical debate and was translated into Arabic very early, perhaps for use in religious disputation. As the title suggests, the Sophistical Refutations helps one diagnose bad arguments. As for the Rhetoric and Poetics, they may seem to us to have nothing at all to do with logic, but great effort was made to fit them into a unified organon, for instance, by portraying poetic metaphors as implicit syllogisms. The logical discipline was thus a tempting target for those who resented the spread of Greek ideas into Arabic-speaking culture. We see this with the debate between the Christian philosopher Abu Bishir Mata and the grammarian al-Sirafi. Our information about this event, which occurred in 937 or 938, is indirect and preserved by reporters sympathetic to al-Sirafi. But it seems that the logician was indeed trounced by the grammarian. Abu Bishir apparently provoked the debate with the grand claims he made for logic. Quoting Greek commentators on Aristotle, he declared it the indispensable tool for knowing correct from faulty speech, and unsound from sound concept. Manna. This claim is likely to find our sympathy. How can one distinguish true from false without understanding the difference between valid and invalid arguments, which is surely the province of logic? But Abu Bishir went further. He insisted that Whereas grammar operates with the linguistic expression or utterance, lafz, logic's domain is the level of the mental concept, mana, underlying the linguistic expression. Here, his Aristotelianism was showing. The idea that language expresses a mental concept can be found at the beginning of Aristotle's On Interpretation. There, Aristotle adds that different people express the same affections of the soul using different sounds, as when a German says Hund, where an English speaker would say dog. Logic, inferred Abu Bishir and other members of the Baghdad school, is a universal science that studies the standards of correct reasoning for all humankind. By contrast, grammar is parochial, the study of correct expression within some given language. Against this, al-Sirafi made the powerful point that an intimate knowledge of language is needed to avoid error when we are reasoning. One must be aware of the ambiguous meanings of terms and master grammatical constructions in order to phrase one's thoughts accurately. Tellingly, he also challenged Abu Bishir to use his logic to solve a hypothetical legal issue about land ownership. This would not be the last time that the reasoning involved in jurisprudence, fiqh, would appear as a rival to the theory of reasoning put forward by experts in logic. About 4 centuries later, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a massive polemic with the self-explanatory title Refutation of the Logicians. Like al-Sirafi, he pointed to the gulf between real-life reasoning and the idealized syllogisms studied in logic. For instance, the number of premises required in a given argument depends not on rules laid down by Aristotle, but on each person's background knowledge and assumptions. Ibn Taymiyyah illustrated with a legal example. If a Muslim who knows that wine is intoxicating hears that the Prophet forbids drinking intoxicating beverages, he will thereby understand that he shouldn't drink wine. Someone who doesn't know that wine is intoxicating would have to add this as an additional premise. But even this premise would leave the argument ineffectual for non-Muslims. More generally, Ibn Taymiyyah argued that the sort of reasoning used in law is more feasible and effective than the sort fetishized by the philosophers. Aristotle and his followers had understood knowledge in the strict and proper sense. Greek, episteme, Arabic, ilm, as involving necessary and universal truth claims, in which one general term is predicated of another. So a standard scientific syllogism for the Aristotelians would be something like this. All giraffes are animals. All animals have sensation. Therefore, all giraffes have sensation. The point of such a syllogism is to explain the universal truth that giraffes have sensation by referring to the fact that they are animals. Against this, Ibn Taymiyyah pointed out that our knowledge is always grounded in encounters with particular things, and that universal judgments are generalizations from such encounters. Isn't it as good or even better, then, to use judgments about particulars in our reasoning, as the jurist does? Besides which, as even the philosophers agreed, the best thing of all to know about is God, and he is not universal, but particular. Some of the points Ibn Taymiyyah made in his refutation had already been made by authors with a friendlier attitude to philosophy and logic, like Suravardi and Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. They wanted to revise, but not abandon logic as they found it in the Aristotelian organon, and above all, in Avicenna. Avicenna himself had radically rethought Aristotelian logic, not least with new ideas about modality. that is, necessity, contingency, and impossibility. After him, logicians continued to notice and fill gaps in the system. They noticed, for instance, that many perfectly good inferences cannot be put into the form of an Aristotelian syllogism. One much discussed example was the relational syllogism. For example, the Eiffel Tower is bigger than the elephant. The elephant is bigger than the mouse. Therefore, the Eiffel Tower is bigger than the mouse. Right down through the late Ottoman Empire, we find authors attempting to extend the resources of Aristotelian Avicennan logic to deal with inferences like this. For another example of developments in logic, see Box 7. Box 7. The Liar Paradox. The famous liar paradox, first discussed in antiquity, turns on self-referential assertions like, "This statement is false." If that statement is false, then it is true. But if it is true, then it is false. In the Islamic world, this paradox already received attention from early mutakallimun. They posed the question whether someone who had never before told a lie and then states, "I am a liar," counts as a liar or not. Later on, in the post-Avicennan period, many philosopher-theologians offered analyses of the paradox. Some proposed that "this statement is false" is actually neither true nor false. For instance, Al-Tusi argued that the truth or falsehood of a sentence depends on whether what it says about something else, not itself, is accurate. Unfortunately, this solution would make it impossible to make any true or false self-referential statements. Yet, it surely looks true to say, "This statement is in English," and false to say, "This statement is in German." The liar paradox was further debated by philosophers at Shiraz. One of them, the elder Dashtaki, suggested distinguishing between first and second-order truth. Normally, he pointed out, one sentence can be about another sentence without causing any problems. If I say, "What Mary says is false," then I have made a second-order statement, that is, a statement about a statement. In that case, what I say will be true just when what Mary says is false. This causes no difficulty. The problem is that in the liar case, the sentence is about its own truth or falsehood, so that we do have the possibility of inconsistency between the first and second-order levels. In the long run, and despite the complaints of critics like Ibn Taymiyyah, logic became a standard part of the education of religious scholars across the Islamic world. Just like beginning philosophy students in late antique Alexandria, students at madrasas in early modern India, Persia, or Egypt would encounter logical textbooks early in their studies. Not a work by Aristotle or the introduction of Porphyry, but a post-Avicennan logical treatise like Al-Khattabi's Risala. The Supremacy of Reason. The most confident, even aggressive stance taken in favor of philosophy in the Islamic world is to be found in Al-Farabi and in authors influenced by him, especially Averroes. Al-Farabi begins from the idea that we want to achieve certainty. In a short treatise on this subject, he acknowledged that there may be different degrees of certainty. I might, for instance, count myself as having certainty that Avicenna's real name was Ibn Sina, because I read it in a book from a reputable publisher. But the highest degree of certainty, which Al-Farabi calls absolute certainty, cannot be acquired through this sort of second-hand information gathering, nor can absolute certainty even be concerned with such things as Avicenna's real name. Absolute certainty is a feature of knowledge in the strict sense, or science, ilm, which means being certain about universal and necessary truths. How then to achieve certainty about such truths? Al-Farabi's answer was burhan, or demonstration. Burhan was also the name given to the Arabic version of the posterior analytics, in which Aristotle set down the requirement that scientific truths should be necessary and universal. In line with Aristotle's theory, Al-Farabi thought that demonstrations are syllogistic arguments that yield the appropriate, scientific sort of truths as conclusions. The syllogistic argument explains why the conclusion is true, as we saw with the giraffe example. But of course a syllogism is only as strong as its premises. Suppose, going back to that example, that I wonder why it is that all animals have sensation. This appeared as a premise in our argument, but it may itself have a further explanation. For instance, that all animals need nourishment and require sensation to locate that nourishment. There is a threat of regress here. It would be troubling if every explanatory demonstration stood in need of further demonstrations to explain why its premises are true. To avoid this, Aristotle and his followers invoked first principles, truths which stand in no further need of explanation. These principles, which might be basic rules of reasoning like the whole is greater than the part, or general facts about the world gleaned from sensation, provide the foundations upon which Aristotelian science rests. Another member of the Baghdad school, Ibn Adi, used this idea to explain logic's role as an instrument for philosophy. The inference rules of Aristotle's syllogistic tells us how to combine first principles into valid arguments. These arguments securely establish further truths, which can then be further combined using the logical rules to derive even more truths. When it comes to human beliefs, first principles and demonstratively proven conclusions are the gold standard. But Al-Farabi was prepared to hand out silver and bronze medals, too. After all, as he himself admitted when he allowed for different degrees of certainty, not all true human beliefs reach the standard realized in demonstrative science. We routinely rely on testimony and on widely held beliefs, and accept arguments that we find merely persuasive rather than probative. Al-Farabi looked again to Aristotelian organon to understand these sorts of beliefs. When we argue on the basis of assumptions or commonly held opinions, we are engaging in dialectic, which is studied in the topics. Merely persuasive arguments, meanwhile, are classified as rhetorical. No prizes will be awarded for guessing which Aristotelian work deals with these. With these distinctions in hand, Al-Farabi was ready to make a bold proposal about the relation between philosophy, theology, and religion. A prophet who brings revelation to his people would not get very far if he presented them with demonstrative syllogisms. So instead, he speaks to them with powerfully convincing images and symbols. In other words, the language of revelation is characteristically rhetorical. As for dialectical arguments, which simply presuppose premises rather than tracing them back to rock-solid first principles, they are, in Al-Farabi's eyes, typical of kalam. This does not, of course, mean that the mutakallimun were always arguing for false conclusions. For instance, Al-Farabi would agree with the Mutazilites that God exists, is one, is incorporeal, and is the first cause of all things. It's just that the Kalam arguments for these conclusions were not demonstrative. These ideas were taken forward in Andalusia by Averroes in his Fasl al-Maql, usually translated, Decisive Treatise. Here, Averroes wrote from the point of view of a jurist. He came from a family of Maliki legal scholars and was himself chief judge in Cordova. Islamic legal judgments often addressed the question of whether a given activity is required, encouraged, licit, discouraged, or forbidden. In the Decisive Treatise, Averroes applied this sort of question to philosophy itself. On the basis of Quranic injunctions like, "Take heed, you who have eyes," Surah 59, Ayah 2, Averroes inferred that the revelation instructs believers to seek knowledge. And what is philosophy, if not the search for knowledge? Thus, philosophy is not just licit or encouraged, but actually required for Muslims, albeit only for the few who have the talent and opportunity to travel the daunting path towards scientific understanding. Other Muslims must content themselves with true beliefs induced by persuasion. Averroes agreed with Al-Farabi that this sort of belief is appropriate for the normal religious believer and that Kalam operates with dialectical arguments. Such argumentation could be dangerous. Averroes complained that the dialectical procedures of the theologians did not converge on agreement, leading to strife and even violence within the community. Averroes was not saying that there are two different, even inconsistent, sets of beliefs, one for the philosophers and another for everyday believers. Rather, both groups have the same core of true beliefs. It's just that the philosophers have certain knowledge attained through demonstration, whereas the rhetorical class of believers are persuaded of things they can't prove and grasp the truths symbolically. The normal believer may understand God to be powerful by picturing him on a throne, whereas the philosopher can prove that he is the first cause of the physical universe. This is another reason why it was unwise for the Mutakallimun to debate the meaning of the revelation publicly. It could confuse the rhetorical class to hear the theologians arguing for God's incorporeality. Exegesis of the Quran should instead be left to the philosophers. They are the only ones who can be sure to interpret the revelation's true meaning, since they can check their interpretations of Scripture against what they already know to be true on independent grounds. They should, however, go about this quietly, being careful not to shake the convictions of other Muslims. For related dispute within Judaism, see Box 8. Box 8. The Principles of the Jewish Law. Like Al-Farabi, Maimonides, see Figure 6, believed that knowledge should have a foundational structure. He applied this to the Jewish law itself, identifying a group of 13 key principles upon which the rest of the law was founded. Within this group of 13, 3 principles had particular significance. God exists, is one, and is incorporeal. Maimonides' attempt to give the law this sort of scientific structure was challenged by a number of Jewish thinkers, both in Andalusia and in southern France. Maimonides' insistence that his co-religionists must deny the corporeality of God was already contentious. Kabbalistic authors indulged in bodily descriptions of God, and one of them remarked that many Jews, including Maimonides' betters, had taken such descriptions at face value. A different sort of critical response came from Asdai Kriskas. His remarkable assault on Aristotelian physics was staged in order to show the unreliability of Maimonides' argument for God's existence. Not, of course, because Kriskas denied the existence of God, but because he feared that Maimonides was placing the law on shaky foundations. He also questioned Maimonides' idea that we are commanded to believe the principles. Belief doesn't respond to commands, but to good reasons for believing. Later, the Spanish exile, Isaac Abravanel, denied that the law has many genuine principles at all. Rather, it must be accepted through faith, emunah, in its entirety. Nonetheless, Abravanel thought that Maimonides' axiomatic approach could be justified on pedagogical grounds. One might start instructing a believer with so-called principles before moving on to more specific aspects of the law. The limits of reason. A prime example of the sort of public disputation that bothered Averroes was Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers. Its project is basically a negative one. Al-Ghazali sought not to offer an alternative set of theories, but to show that Avicenna's theories are unproven. This was not because Al-Ghazali rejected the desirability of certainty. To the contrary, the quest for certainty is a leitmotif of his intellectual autobiography, The Deliverer from Error. It describes an epistemological crisis he experienced as a young man, born out of considering the way that sense perception can be corrected by the mind. For example, shadows cast by the sun look to be standing still, but we know that they are moving very slowly throughout the day. How can we rule out that the judgments of the mind are likewise subject to some higher court of epistemological authority? Even the apparently indubitable truths of mathematics and logic could fall prey to this sort of skeptical worry. Al-Ghazali was freed from the impasse only thanks to a light cast into his heart by God. The experience taught him that human reason cannot provide the highest form of insight and certainty. That is rather the province of the mystic, whose direct connection to the divine trumps even the most certain demonstrative argumentation. On the other hand, human reason is reliable in its proper sphere. The problem is not using reason, but thinking that reason can do too much, for instance, by claiming to discern rules that would govern even the actions of God, as the Mutazilites and Avicenna had dared to do. Averroes would later charge Al-Ghazali with being an Asherite with the Asherites, a philosopher with the philosophers, and a Sufi with the Sufis. While it's true that Kalam philosophy and Sufism all played a role in his thought, this does not necessarily mean that he was inconsistent. His willingness to take over ideas from Avicenna was tempered by his Asherite commitment to the untrammeled freedom and transcendence of God, who is properly grasped only by the few who are granted mystical insight. Another combination of philosophy and mysticism, though without the Asherism, can be found in Suravardi. Explaining the methodology of his new illuminationist approach to philosophy, he said that it travels not one, but two paths. One is the method of discursive inquiry and argumentation, characteristic of the Peripatetics. The other was the higher road of mystical intuition, enjoyed not only by the Sufis of Islam, but also by the sages of Greece, Persia, and India. They were all granted a direct vision of God, the light of lights, and on this basis, supposedly, agreed on a range of doctrines taken over by Suravardi. As we'll see later, he also proposed a novel epistemology that could help to explain such mystical insights. Al-Ghazali and Suravardi set the tone for developments in the later Islamic world. Al-Farabi and Averroes had claimed that certainty was the privilege of the philosopher alone, who achieves it through demonstrative arguments. Post-Avicennan theologians, including Al-Ghazali, agreed with them that certainty was an admirable goal. Whether that goal could be reached through nothing but human reasoning, though, was another matter. In the work of a theologian like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, we see the full flower of the dialectical method characteristic of Kalam. He did follow earlier Mutakallimun in also recognizing a type of knowledge as necessary, meaning that we cannot help endorsing it. But when it came to more contentious and difficult points, his characteristic method was to consider all the positions that had been, or could be, adopted on a given philosophical issue. In the end, all but one position would be shown to be incoherent or implausible. Scrupulous in his methodology, Al-Razi would not always assert the certain truth of the victorious position, the one that has survived the process of elimination. Instead, it might be designated as most adequate, akrab, among the options considered. When Al-Razi concluded his arguments with the pious formula, "But God knows best," he meant it. The later tradition of philosophical theology is a rebuke to the charge of methodological carelessness leveled at Kalam by Al-Farabi and Averroes. Al-Razi was as much a rationalist as the philosophers, but more modest when it came to the question of what reason can establish beyond all doubt. This was entirely in keeping with the tenets of Asherism, a tradition which would sometimes take refuge in the expression bila kaif, or without saying how. For instance, some Asherites would insist that God does have distinct attributes, but refuse to say how exactly we should understand these attributes and their relation to God's essence. Asherite Kalam did not necessarily go hand in hand with mysticism. Al-Razi was no Sufi, but in Al-Ghazali and certain other later thinkers, the epistemic modesty of the Mutakallimun did serve the ends of mysticism, as for that matter did limits on philosophical demonstration recognized by the philosophers themselves. Both Kalam and Avicennan philosophy admitted that God remains, at least to some extent, beyond the understanding of natural human reasoning. So there was plenty of room to say that mystical insight must complement discursive, rational argument. The mystical tradition offered the prospect of going where reason could not. Sufi ascetic practices helped to direct the developing mystic's attention away from worldly things and towards the divine. Stories about the early Sufi, Rabia al-Adawiya, tell of her unconcern for the world around her and her yearning for God. She is said to have remarked, "The love of God inhibits me from the love of his creatures." The most famous Sufi of all, the Persian poet Rumi, famously used images of sex and drunkenness to convey the mystic's union with God. Ultimately, the Sufi's goal was to achieve not some sort of discursive account of God, but rather an obliteration or annihilation, fana, of the self, in which the mystic dissolves in God's being, like a drop of vinegar in an ocean of honey. Yet, Rumi did not abandon reason entirely. He remarked that the leg of the reasoners is wooden, and hence unsteady, but he also retained a significant role for the intellect, aql, making it the capacity by which we grasp God. The direct union with God achieved by the Sufis promised to remedy the deficiencies of the philosopher's reason. but talk of union was dangerous too. At their most provocative, the Sufis could be taken to eliminate all distinction between God and what God has created, as when Al-Hallaj notoriously remarked, "I am the truth." Some, like Ibn Taymiyyah, were quick to denounce this tendency among the more extreme Sufis, but the Sufis themselves were alive to the danger and took pains to preserve God's transcendence, despite recognizing his union with, or presence to, all other things. On this score, the greatest contribution was that made by Ibn Arabi, which was then systematized and fused with philosophical language by Al-Kanawi and other members of the Akbarian school, an allusion to Ibn Arabi's epithet, Al-Akbar, the greatest. Ibn Arabi made much of the divine names found in the Quran, seeing them as the means by which God made himself manifest to his creation. Had the names not been revealed to us, we could not speak of God at all, but the divine names are more than mere labels. They are the very relationships that God bears to created things, and ultimately identical with those things. The created universe is distinct from God, and characterized by multiplicity rather than God's total simplicity, in just the way that God's various names are distinct from him and form a multiplicity. God, in himself, though, remains beyond all that he has made. There is a strong parallel between these ideas and the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, which is most likely no coincidence. Kabbalah emerged from the same cultural context that produced Ibn Arabi, and may have been influenced to some extent by Islamic mysticism. The Sfirot of Kabbalistic theory play a role akin to the divine names in Ibn Arabi's thought, symbolically evoking the emanation of God's influence into the creative world. Again, God himself remains beyond our grasp. He is, as the Kabbalists of southern France put it, the Ein Sof, or infinite. This spherotic theory looks to be a kind of theoretical account of God's relationship to the universe, but this was only one aspect of medieval Kabbalah. Again, like Sufism, Jewish mysticism also had a practical dimension, with ritualistic and meditative practices designed to provoke the experience of union with the divine. The mystics themselves noted that their enterprise transcended religious boundaries. We've already seen Suravardi claiming common cause with sages from multiple traditions, both within and outside Islam. Two thinkers of Islamic India, the Mughal prince Dara Shikoh and Shah Wali Allah, had a similarly ecumenical outlook. Particularly striking is Dara Shikoh's treatise, The Confluence of the Two Oceans. The title refers to the agreement between the traditions of Islam and classical India, as represented especially by the Upanishads, which Dara translated himself. The confluence lists correspondences between Sanskrit philosophical terminology and the technical terms of philosophical Sufism, and argues for the agreement of the two traditions on points such as the nature of the soul and bodily resurrection. Dara thus took very seriously an injunction he found in one Hindu sage to the effect that the truth does not belong solely to any one religion. Of course, none of this deterred philosophical Sufis from a profound engagement with Islam and its key texts. Shah Wali Allah's ecumenicism was tempered by his insistence that Islam is the most perfect manifestation of the truth shared by all religions. And if we consider another great philosopher of recent centuries who drew on Sufism, Mullah Sadra, we find a thinker whose thought and writing is steeped in the language of the Quranic revelation. Like several other Muslim philosophers, notably Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, Sadra wrote works of commentary on the Quran and saw no tension between this activity and the pursuit of philosophy. Sadra wove concepts from the philosophical and Sufi traditions into his exegesis. He echoed Ibn Arabi's idea that the divine names are manifestations of God, and even applied this to the Quran itself. The revelation is God's word, and thus contains within it all of creation. Al-Surat al-Fatiha, the first or opening chapter, in turn contains within it all that is expressed in the rest of the Quran. Sadra's innovative metaphysics was ultimately an attempt to explain God's creation as an unfolding or manifestation of what, in God, is perfectly unified. Chapter 3. God and Being. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. This is one version of the Muslim profession of faith, or Shahada, which one utters when converting to Islam. The first part of the Shahada, beautifully alliterative in Arabic, La ilaha illallah, sets out the fundamental Islamic belief in God's oneness, or Tawheed. Muslims, like Jews and Christians, recognize no other divinities but the all-powerful creator of the universe. This might seem to make pagan philosophy a poor match for the Abrahamic religions. After all, we associate ancient paganism with a pantheon of multiple gods. But the philosophical treatises that came into Arabic-speaking culture, thanks to the Abbasid translation movement, typically recognized a single first cause of all things, even if those treatises also spoke of other, inferior supernatural principles too. The Falsafa, accordingly, had no hesitation in using Hellenic sources to argue for and explicate the doctrine of Tawhid, taking them as a jumping-off point for their own original ideas. God as the true one. The first philosophe to exploit the potential of the Greek-Arabic sources for this purpose was Al-Kindi. In his On First Philosophy, he portrayed God as the true one, free of all multiplicity. As an interpretation of Tawhid, this goes well beyond the mere assertion of monotheism. But rigorous insistence on the simplicity of God has a significant advantage. Al-Kindi argued that all things in the created world must be characterized by both unity and multiplicity. Since God has only unity, he is radically different from created things, and this secures his transcendence. And as the source of unity for all other things, he is the first cause. There is an apparent disadvantage here, too, though. It seems sensible to say that God has multiple features, if only because he is so variously described in revealed Scripture. How can God be called both powerful and knowing, for example, if he is wholly without multiplicity of any kind? After all, power and knowledge look to be two distinct features or attributes. Sifat. Al-Kindi, nonetheless, argued in On First Philosophy that God's unity rules out any application of human language to him. Here he drew on Aristotelian logical works, considering the various kinds of predication and showing how each of them would involve plurality. A genus like animal, for instance, may be a unity, but also implies a multiplicity of species that fall under it. Human, giraffe, dog. Hence, genera are inapplicable to the utter unity that is God. Apart from the logical works just mentioned, Al-Kindi was here responding to the Platonic writings of Plotinus and Proclus, translated in his circle. See boxes 9 and 10. In them, he found a first principle that was totally without multiplicity, and a source for unity in other things. A further influence on al-Kindi was kalam. The Mutazilites, too, defended a rigorous interpretation of Tawhid. They refused to accept the reality of attributes that were in any way distinct from God, fearing that this would yield a plurality of divine things. Not only God, but also His power, His knowledge, etc. Not that these early theologians made so bold as to deny the validity of Quranic language. Rather, they interpreted it in a way consistent with God's simplicity. An example would be the statement of Abul Hudayl that God is powerful through a power that is not other than Him, knowledgeable through a knowledge that is not other than Him, and so on. Box 9. Philosophical Theology. The Greek Legacy. For philosophers inspired by the Greco-Arabic translations, two authors loomed above all others when it came to conceptions of God: Aristotle and Plotinus. Aristotle devoted parts of his physics and metaphysics to a first divine cause, a self-thinking intellect that gives rise to all motion in the universe. Plotinus, by contrast, postulated a whole hierarchy of principles beyond the physical cosmos, at the top of which was an utterly simple first cause: the One, or the Good. In one of several disagreements with Aristotle, Plotinus made the One not an intellect, but superior to a second, intellective principle, on the basis that even a self-thinking intellect would be multiple, since it would be both that which is thinking and that which is being thought. While some falsafa, such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna, adhered to the Aristotelian line and made God a thinking being, Al-Kindi preferred Plotinus's view and insisted that God is beyond intellection. A further challenge for the project of combining Aristotle and Plotinus with Abrahamic religion is that neither of them really envisioned their first cause as a creator. Aristotle presented his God as a cause of motion, not existence, and Plotinus's one/good was, naturally enough, above all a source of unity and goodness. Of course, nothing can exist without being one, so Al-Kindi could follow the Plotinian understanding of the first cause as a source of unity and still think of God as a creator. But new conceptual tools were needed to clarify what it would mean for God to be a cause of existence, tools which would be provided by Avicenna. This sort of position can be found early on in the Jewish tradition as well, notably in the case of Sa'adia Gaon. Like Al-Kindi and the Mutazilites, Sa'adia placed great emphasis on the perfect unity of God. He linked unity closely to immateriality. The ascription of multiplicity to God would imply that He is in some sense bodily. Box 10. Neoplatonism and Negative Theology. At the end of one of his treatises, Plotinus gave some blunt advice for anyone seeking to grasp his transcendent first principle: take away everything. Neoplatonic currents in the Arabic world accordingly pushed thinkers toward negative theology. We see this among the philosopher missionaries of the Ismaili branch of Shi'ism, who took inspiration from the Arabic Plotinus. One of them, al-Sijistani, went so far as to say that even negations must be negated. In other words, we need to see not only that it is inadequate to call God good or powerful, but also that it is inadequate to say that God is not good or not powerful. In the Jewish tradition, the most ostentatiously Neoplatonic thinker was Ibn Gabirol, Likewise drawing on Greco-Arabic works derived from ancient Platonism, he presented God as a simple one, transcendent above intellect. The complexity of all things other than God can be captured by saying that they have a material aspect. Even incorporeal things like intellect and soul are made up of a spiritual kind of matter, which receives determination by form. This doctrine of universal hylomorphism, meaning that all things apart from God have both matter and form, was frequently attacked in Christendom, where Ibn Gabirol's Fountain of Life was well known in Latin translation. For the same reason, God lies beyond the reach of human cognition, for all human knowledge derives from sensation, which grasps only bodies. We can, however, come to an indirect understanding of God by perceiving that the universe must have a creator. From here we may make a further inference. God is not only one, but also living, knowledgeable, and powerful. These characteristics are inextricably connected with the ability to create. However, we do not actually have a multiplicity of attributes here. That, Sa'adiyya thought, was the mistake that led the Christians to their dogma of the Trinity, with life, knowledge, and power being represented by the three persons. To avoid this error, we should say that in God's cause, these features are perfectly united. It is only human language that leads us to distinguish them from one another as distinct attributes. The idea that God is understood only indirectly, and on the basis of what he has created, reappeared later in the Jewish tradition. Maimonides's Guide of the Perplexed sought to resolve the apparent clash between the philosophical understanding of God and the language applied to God in the Bible. The philosophical account makes God simple, immaterial, and transcendent. Indeed, beyond the reach of human language, whereas the Bible routinely describes him with words that can apply to created things. Maimonides proposed a multi-pronged strategy for interpreting such descriptions. First, superficially positive attributes can be understood as concealed negations. When we call God good, we might mean that he is not evil. To call him knowing is simply to say that he is not ignorant. So understood, these positive attributes fit into Maimonides's project of negative theology, since they do not actually apply human language to the divine. Other attributes, meanwhile, can retain their positive meaning, so long as they are referred to the created world rather than God. If we say that God is providential, we are, despite appearances, speaking about the universe, which is here indirectly described as well-ordered. Finally, there is biblical language that must be read allegorically or symbolically. If God is called a lion, this should be taken as a metaphorical way of saying that he is powerful. Of course, we can't take God is powerful at face value either. Instead, we should now apply one of the first two strategies to the statement yielded by the symbolic interpretation. Thus, the upshot of saying God is a lion might be something like God is not weak. God as the necessary existent. The single most influential philosophical argument to emerge in the Islamic world was Avicenna's proof of God's existence. Known as the demonstration of the truthful, Burhan al-Siddiqin, it was gratefully received by philosophers of various faiths, and even endorsed by theologians who rejected other aspects of Avicenna's philosophical theology. Thanks to his proof, it became standard in the post-Avicennan Islamic tradition to call God the necessary of existence, Wajib al-Wajud. This was the point of Avicenna's argument, to show that there must be at least one necessary existent. Let's begin our look at the proof by asking what it would mean for something to exist without being necessary. Obviously, such a thing is not in itself impossible, since that would mean that it couldn't exist at all. Rather, it will be contingent. This means that the thing's nature, or as Avicenna would say, its essence, mahia, does not settle the question of its existence. Avicenna gave the example of a triangle. Some things are required by the essence of a triangle. For instance, having 3 sides, or having internal angles that sum up to 180 degrees. But existence is not one of them. We cannot tell, just by thinking about what it means to be a triangle, whether a triangle exists or not. Such contingent things require an external cause to make them exist. For Avicenna, the cause tips the scales by setting the question of whether it will exist or not. A genuine cause will, in fact, necessitate existence for the effect. To sum up, for Avicenna, contingent things in themselves neither exist nor fail to exist, but become necessary through another when they are determined to exist thanks to an external cause. By contrast, a thing that is necessary of existence through itself would be something that must exist by its very essence, without requiring any external cause. This brings us to the question answered by Avicenna's famous proof: is there in fact such a thing? Is anything necessary of existence in itself, or are all existing things merely contingent, having received their existence from an outside cause? Avicenna wanted to show that this cannot be the case, and argued as follows. I've simplified slightly. Instead of taking just one contingent item, instead consider the entire aggregate of things that are contingent in themselves. This will be the set of all contingent things that exist now, ever have existed, or ever will exist. See also Box 11. Upon cursory reflection, we see that this aggregate is itself contingent. It can exist, and indeed it does exist. To be convinced of this, you need only look around at all the existing contingent things. But the aggregate needn't have existed. After all, each member of the aggregate could have failed to exist, so surely the aggregate as a whole could likewise have been non-existent. This means that the aggregate requires an external cause in order to make it exist, and if that cause is external to the set of things that are contingent in themselves, then the cause is not itself contingent. It must therefore be necessary in itself. Box 11. Mental existence. Avicenna distinguished between 2 kinds of existence, mental and concrete. Usually when we talk about existence, we are thinking about concrete existence, which is just the reality of things out in the world. But things can also exist in the mind, in which case they have merely mental existence. Typically, a certain essence will have both kinds of existence. Giraffes, for instance, exist both concretely and in the mind. But some essences lack concrete existence and exist only mentally. Centaurs, for example. This apparently rather basic point had wide-ranging consequences in post-Avicennan philosophy. In the dialectical to and fro of philosophical kalam, it tended to stack the deck in favor of skeptical positions. With Avicenna's distinction in hand, authors like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi could demand proof that a given entity, time, for example, really exists concretely as opposed to merely mentally. Later, in the Mughal era of Islamic rule in India, a series of commentaries on the ladder of sciences by Muhibullah al-Bihari asked whether God, as he exists in the mind, might have different properties from those that God actually possesses in reality. He might concretely exist as simple, but exist in the mind with conceptual parts. If, as Avicenna argued, God is the necessary existent, then necessity and existence could be two parts. Generalizing the point, these Indian Muslim scholars posed the sort of general skeptical worry that was emerging in early modern Europe as well, to the effect that our mental concepts of things may misrepresent the way things really are. Does Avicenna's proof work? It could be attacked at various points. One might challenge the assumption that the whole aggregate of contingent items needs a further cause. After all, if each individual contingent item within the aggregate has a cause, then why do we also need a cause for the aggregate itself? To make the objection more concrete, consider an infinite series of mothers and daughters that has led up to your mother. This example is faithful to Avicenna. He believed that the universe is eternal and that the species of things have always been the same, so that the human race has also existed eternally. Each woman has a mother, and we do not demand some external mother for the whole infinite series of women. It's a moot point whether similar reasoning would apply to the whole aggregate of existing things. But the popularity of Avicenna's proof shows that many philosophers shared his basic intuition, namely that the universe of contingent things could indeed have failed to exist, and that its existence thus stands in need of an explanation. Another difficulty for Avicenna was that if the proof does work, all it shows is that there is at least one existent that is necessary in itself. Without further elaboration, that looks like something an atheist could cheerfully admit. But Avicenna gave further arguments to show that the trait of necessity implies the other features we associate with God. For instance, immateriality, eternity, power, goodness, and knowledge. This project actually occupies much more space in his various writings on philosophical theology than the initial proof. With typical ingenuity, Avicenna argued, for instance, that there can be only one necessary existent, since if there were two, then some external cause would be needed to distinguish the two from one another. But then they would be necessitated by another, rather than being necessary in themselves. The necessary existent must also be immaterial, lest it depend for its existence on its matter. It must be perfectly good, since goodness is implied by actual existence, and so on through all the traditional divine attributes. One can hardly help admiring the elegance of Avicenna's strategy, which is to extract the whole of traditional philosophical theology out of the core notion of necessity. But from the point of view of later detractors like al-Ghazali, Avicenna paid too high a price to achieve his theoretical simplicity. He made God not just necessarily existent in himself, this much everyone was happy to accept, but necessary in every way. This meant that God could no longer be conceived along Asherite lines as a gratuitously willing agent who creates, rewards, and punishes as he pleases. In addition to such scruples about the scope of divine necessity, the basic distinction Avicenna made between essence and existence led to metaphysical difficulties. Are we really to believe that concretely existing things out in the world are somehow compounded of an essence and existence, as if these are two parts that have been combined into a whole? A major critic of this conception was Suravardi. He was later described as having endorsed the primacy of essence, in contrast to the primacy of existence held up by Sufis and, in due course, by Malasadra. This label is misleading, since Suravardi in fact denied the external reality of both essence and existence. For him, the essence-existence distinction is a purely mental one, with no corresponding distinction in the things themselves. Against the realist position, Suravardi pointed out the awkwardness of supposing that essences have some metaphysical status of their own that is neutral with respect to existence. In order for an essence to be real enough to be distinct from the existence it will receive, the essence would already have to exist. As for existence, to suppose that it is something real seems likewise to involve thinking that it exists. A regress looms. If my existence exists, then the existence of my existence presumably also exists, and so on. But this looks absurd. These arguments look fairly convincing, but Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, while not shy in criticizing Avicenna on other points, rose to the defense of a realist understanding of the Avicennan distinction. He blocked the regress of second- and third-order existences by reminding us why we postulate existence in the first place, because essences are merely contingent in themselves and need some external cause to make them exist or not exist. Existence in itself is not a contingent essence, since it has no need to receive a further existence. Essences, too, must be real, since otherwise there would be no real distinctions between things out in the world. A further debate erupted within the realist camp when it came to the application of the essence-existence distinction to God. The upshot of Avicenna's proof seemed to be that God, like created things, has an essence distinct from his existence. The difference would be that, while God's essence guarantees his existence, the essences of created things do not settle whether they exist or not. Unfortunately, this seems to undermine God's simplicity. No less than Al-Kindi, Sa'adiyya, and so on, the Avicennans were committed to God's oneness, which might be thought incompatible with bifurcating him into essence and existence. Al-Razi applied the distinction to God nonetheless, in order to retain a unified conception of existence. The same sort of existence belongs both to you, to me, and to God. The only difference is whether the existence comes from outside, as in your and my case, or from the thing itself, as in God's case. Al-Razi's rival commentator Al-Tusi seized on suggestions in Avicenna that God or his essence is identical to his existence. On this basis, he suggested that there is only a sort of analogy, tashkik, between divine and created existence. The existence that is identical with God is, obviously, not the existence that belongs to you and me. Instead, the existence we enjoy is merely a dim reflection of the divine existence. The disagreement between Al-Razi and Al-Tusi mirrors a debate that was going on in Latin Christendom at about the same time, provoked by reflection on the same materials in Avicenna. Thomas Aquinas defended an analogy theory of being very much like Al-Tusi's, while Duns Scotus, like Al-Razi, asserted that being or existence is always the same, whether it belongs to God or created things. This is just one example of the impact of Avicenna's ideas across the spectrum of later medieval philosophy, both within and beyond the Islamic world. God as the light of lights. One of the more contentious questions in modern-day research on Avicenna is the extent to which he can be seen as a mystic. He certainly at least paid lip service to the Sufi tradition, in a few places using such mystical terminology as taste, dhawq, to describe our grasp of the divine. But Avicenna's real importance for the history of philosophical Sufism lies in the adoption of his ideas by other thinkers. This began already with Ibn Arabi, who took over the Avicennan view that created things are made necessary through their cause. When it came to the question of existence, however, he and his follower, Al-Qunawi, distanced themselves from Avicenna to some extent. Seeking, as always, to emphasize God's transcendence, they portrayed the divine as a non-being or nothingness beyond created being. Even created things begin as non-existence, in that they reside in God's knowledge and power, waiting to be made manifest in the universe. Ibn Arabi used the phrase, breath of the merciful, to describe the thing's emergence into being, an image that will be taken up by Malasadra. At about the same time, another philosopher with mystical inclinations was rethinking Avicenna's metaphysics, Suravardi. At first glance, his own metaphysics may seem to be little different, with talk of light substituted for talk of existence. God is now described as the light of lights, which has no need of external illumination, and angels are luminous beings emanated forth from him. Souls, too, are lights, immaterial and thus pure of the darkness of bodies. While this does look very like the sort of alternative scheme put forward by Avicenna, and before him by Al-Farabi, it would be a mistake to see light as a metaphor for existence. We've already seen Suravardi arguing against a realist understanding of existence. For him, it is nothing but a mental judgment. Also, Suravardi insisted that his talk of light was not metaphorical. Souls, angels, and God are really lights, albeit not the sort of visible lights we see in the physical world. To call these things lights is to say that they can become evident and known merely by being present, the way that visible light is seen whenever it is present to a healthy eye. Centuries later, Malasadra and other Iranian thinkers who drew inspiration from him made enthusiastic use of Suravardi's light terminology and embraced the illuminationist label. This, despite the fact that, on the key question of existence, Sadra could not have disagreed more strongly with Suravardi. He was a realist concerning existence, and for him, talk of light and talk of existence were indeed interchangeable. At the same time, he endorsed what had in the Sufi tradition been called the unity of existence, wadat al-wajud. This phrase intimates that all created reality is a manifestation of the one true reality, namely, God. This is not inconsistent with the philosophical Sufis calling God non-being. That characterization simply distinguishes him from the sort of being characteristic on dependent, created, manifested existence. Things other than God are, as a Sufi might put it, mere ripples upon the ocean of divine being. Unity of existence went nicely with their idea that in mystical union the self is obliterated. Such annihilation is actually the dispelling of an illusory estrangement from God. As Rumi put it, we are like shadows in love with the sun, which disappear in its light when their desire is fulfilled. Such teachings threatened to eliminate all distinctions between God and his creatures. To avoid outright monism, Sadra reached for a conceptual tool first adumbrated by Avicenna and then developed by Al-Tusi: analogical gradation, tashkik. In Sadra's hands, tashkik provides a way to steer between, on the one hand, a monist identification of God with all other things, and on the other hand, a radical separation of God from his creatures. It's no wonder that Sadra adopted illuminationist language, because light provides him with the perfect metaphor. Like a brilliant light whose illumination dims only gradually, God is pure existence, and his effects receive existence from him in ever-diminishing degrees. It is the difference in the intensity of existence that makes, for instance, a soul a different sort of being from a body. Furthermore, as in the image of the radiating light, there are no sharp divisions between the degrees of existence. What we have here is a gradual fade to black, not a series of differently illuminated bands. Earlier Sufis like Al-Qunawi had spoken of the specification, tayyun, of being that occurs when God's infinite existence is contracted into the created things that are his manifestations. Sadra can accept this too, but not if it is taken to imply that there are hard and fast distinctions between those specified, created things. Rather, the distinctions we make between things are just that, distinctions we make. Here, he agreed with Suravardi in rejecting the concrete reality of essences. They are only mental constructs, conceptual boxes we use to divide the unity of reality into distinct, manageable items. Surely, though, there is a difference between dogs and cats, between chalk and cheese. How can Sadra think that such differences are mere illusions? Well, that would actually be putting the point too strongly. He was no full-blown monist who denies all real diversity. Rather, he wanted to say that the diversity is gradual due to the continuous reduction in the intensity of existence as it pours forth and away from God. This is true not only at one time, but also over time. In a further radical move, Sadra contends that all things are constantly changing, even in their very substance. He gives examples like boiling water, which is in the process of changing into steam, and an embryo, which is gradually becoming an infant. The point applies in less obvious cases, too, for instance, to you as you change, moment by moment, from infant to child, to adult, to senior citizen. Characteristically, Sadra sees confirmation for his theory in the Quran, which states, "When you see the mountains, you think they are stable, but they are fleeting, just like the clouds." Surah 27, Ayah 88. Sadra's theory itself represented a decisive change. It was a shift away from the more or less Aristotelian metaphysics of Avicenna and most of his heirs, who still recognized that reality consists of self-subsisting substances demarcated from one another by their essences. Instead, Sadra presented a dynamic picture of reality, according to which existence comes forth from God as a gradually differentiated unity, and also returns to him through constant change. The intellectual ancestors of this theory were not Avicenna and Aristotle, but rather Neoplatonists like Plotinus, whose works received renewed attention in Safavid Persia in Sadra's day. Despite these ancient resonances, though, Sadrian philosophy has remained relevant, especially in Iran, thanks to exegetes and defenders like Sabzawari in the 19th century and Tabatabayi in the 20th century. Chapter 4. Eternity. The issue most strongly associated with the history of philosophy in the Islamic world is the eternity of the universe. This is rather surprising. It's not exactly a pressing topic in philosophical discussions nowadays, after all. Besides, you might expect Muslim, Jewish, and Christian philosophers simply to assume that the universe is not eternal, but rather created. Yet, the question of eternity deserves its prominence. It features in several key works from the Islamic world, notably Al-Kindi's On First Philosophy, Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, and Maimonides's Guide for the Perplexed, and relates to several other philosophical problems that are indeed pressing issues for us today, such as time, infinity, modality, and causation. Infinity and eternity. What does it mean for something to be eternal? A first approximation might be that something is eternal if it exists at all times. To call something eternal in this sense is both an observation about past history and a prediction about the future. An eternal thing has already existed at all previous times, exists now, and will exist at all future times. But there is an ambiguity here. Suppose that time began only 100 years ago. In that case, something 100 years old that will continue existing indefinitely into the future would be eternal in the sense just suggested, since it would exist at all times. But we might hesitate to call such a thing eternal, and instead insist that genuine eternity requires time to be infinite. With this presupposition in hand, something is eternal only if it has already existed for an infinity of time, exists now, and will continue to exist for an infinity of future time. Both concepts of eternity have their problems. To suppose that time began at some point in the past confronts us with the paradox of how time itself can begin. It seems irresistible to think that, beforehand, there would be earlier moments at which time did not yet exist. But this looks like a contradiction. How can there be moments without time? Unfortunately, assuming an infinite time yields an equally unappealing paradox, for we would need to suppose that an infinite past time has already elapsed in order that we may have reached the present moment. But how can an infinity of time elapse? Both puzzles were raised in antiquity. For Aristotle, the paradox to avoid was rather the first one of admitting that time began. Nor did Aristotle think it was possible that motion ever began, for any motion requires another motion to trigger it. In his technical language,